Thank you so much, Lon, and everybody associated with Allegany Nature Pilgrimage. I was really disappointed that I couldn't be there in person this year. We had planned initially to do a presentation and a couple of snorkel trips. I'm penciled in for next year, so hopefully we can come face-to-face next year. Thank you all who are online for spending part of your Friday evening with me as I tell some stories about this amazing hidden treasure. And as Lon said, I've had the privilege over the last 15 years of snorkeling across the country and even out of the country a bit. So did some work in China over the last 2 years, snorkeling some of the freshwater rivers and lakes there, and hope to return as soon as I'm able to start some education programming. And so the presentation tonight is really a culmination of this book that just came out in March. And this is about 15 years worth of work compiled into one cover of the experiences that I've had in rivers and streams across the country. And that first slide that we showed is an indicator of the why behind this. That when we think of freshwater ecosystems, we really rarely think of them as containing this amazing beauty and diversity and abundance of life, as well as we seem to know these things.
Hey, Keith, I think we lost you there.
I'm still here.
Okay. I kind of hear the music going a little bit, so.
So did you all see the slides going by, and were you able to hear some of that music at all? Anyway, I hope you got to see those pictures. The point is this green curve right here shows an exponential growth in the number of annual extinctions over the last 50 years. So we're in the middle of this extinction crisis, and our freshwater ecosystems are the epicenter of that. The species that live in freshwater rivers, lakes, wetlands are going away faster than species from any other ecosystem on the planet. And snails are a great example of that. There are 900 species of snail in North America. 50% of them are either endangered, extinct, or threatened. And 25%, we just don't have enough data to make up our minds as to what their status is. And they're also an example of one of the driving reasons why I think we're losing freshwater biodiversity as fast as we are. And it goes back to what we opened with, is that people don't really recognize the amazing beauty that's in our freshwater rivers. I mean, these things are in our lives daily. We drive over them, we drive along them, they weave through our towns, and we take a look over the bridges and we see what appears to be kind of muddy water or a reflective surface, and don't think twice about what might be beneath that surface. And there's this incredible diversity of life there that the best way to see it is by getting a mask and a snorkel on your face and getting face down. And so that's what I've done for the last 15 years. I've dedicated most of my time in my life to getting people face down in rivers in a safe and productive kind of way and not a negative kind of way, to experience this amazing beauty and diversity and to kind of open their eyes to what's there and what we're missing from the surface. And here's an example. So these are some students from Boston, and we're in the White River in the Green Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire. And, you know, it's freezing cold water, but the kids are troopers and they're hanging onto this rock and we're all watching this trout. And after a couple of minutes, this girl picks her head out of the water and says, "He's beautiful, I love him." And she puts her head back in the water and she watches this fish for a little bit longer. And then she pulls her head out of the water again and says, "How can we conserve something if we don't even know it's there?" Now, at first, that kind of struck me as a silly statement because we know that fish is there. We probably raised it in a hatchery and placed it in that river. But she also has a pretty valid point that we really don't know what that trout is like living in that river on its own terms. I know what that trout is like on the end of my line. I know the thrill of having a trout latch onto a fly. I know how good they taste. I know how fun it is to catch my own fish and bring it home and cook it. And I spent my undergraduate and graduate career studying freshwater ecology and freshwater ecosystems, but it was always on my terms. We would go to the river and we would pull whatever life we were studying that day out of the water and into the air. And they are so different when we watch these things on their own terms, and it really changes behaviors. And here's an example of that. This is Multnomah Falls. This is in the Columbia River Gorge in Oregon. Just this amazing landscape feature, dramatic, over 100 feet tall. It draws more than 1 million visitors from all across the planet to come and visit this falls. And there's a little walkway that goes from this parking area to the base of the falls, and that walkway winds its way along this tiny little creek. And people never pay any attention to this creek except in the summertime when they stomp around in it to cool off a bit. I wanted to snorkel that creek to see who was living there. And this is what I found. All these little baby fish are juvenile coho salmon. And that's significant because coho salmon, Columbia River coho specifically, have been listed as threatened for the last 15 years. Their numbers aren't going up at all. So their prognosis is pretty bleak. And the fact that I found positive signs of reproduction, hundreds of these coho fry living in Multnomah Creek, was really important. So I contacted my fisheries biologist friend who is responsible for that region. And I said, you got to get those people out of Multnomah Creek. They're stomping on these baby coho salmon fry. They're killing a threatened species. And I figured the next time I went there, there would be a fence up. There'd be maybe some law enforcement or a threat of a fine or something like that. They did a whole lot better job than that. This is what was there. These signs were up along the creek. If you take a look into the stream, what do you see? If you guess small fry, you're right. They're growing big and strong so they can make their way to the ocean. Please stay out of the creek to help us protect the sensitive salmon habitat. And this was the response of those 1 million visitors that were going to the falls. They were engaged with the creek. They were looking to see that life that they didn't know existed before we broke that reflective plane with a mask and a snorkel and snorkeled it. And so that's another kind of salmon. That's a Chinook salmon. And this is a male. And this is another river in Oregon. And this male just traveled upwards of over 1,000 miles to get to these spawning grounds. And so he's dying alive, right? You see all those white patches. That's actually flesh that's starting to rot. And this is the end of his life, right? So these are migratory fish. They spend their lives out at sea. They come into freshwater one time to spawn. And so this is the end. And you see in that eye, I could see that journey, right? That fish and I spent hours together in that stream until I got too cold and had to get out. And he just sat there watching me, trying to figure me out as I watched him trying to figure him out. And there's executive function in that eye. And that's one of the things that snorkeling has really done for me is changed my perspective of things like fish from these really lowly, unintelligent organisms to amazing beings with really incredible executive function going on. This is another male Chinook a couple months later, a little bit further along in the spawning process and in the decomposition process. And you see that they develop this really pretty significant hooked beak, and they get all snaggle-toothed in the front, and they look kind of prehistoric and dinosaur-like. And you can see that more of that flesh is rotting off of that fish. And here's a female. This blue thing in the foreground is my knee. It's in a dry suit. So that blue thing is the dry suit that's covering my leg. And the current is coming in from the right. And so that female Chinook is completely and totally exhausted, and she's about to die. In fact, I watched her die in the lee of my knee. So my knee is making calm water behind it. And she just tucked in there because she's completely exhausted, and that's the end of her life, and she's done. And she's done what she was here to do. She created the next generation of Chinook salmon. And now when she dies, she's going to continue to nourish that stream because her body contributes all that nutrition that it gained from the ocean, and she brought it back up into the watershed. And so a lot of times we think of watersheds as these one-way flows of energy from upstream to down, but they're actually two-way, especially if we remove impediments to fish migration like dams. That all that energy from migratory fish that they gain in the ocean, all that nutrition, can come back up into the watershed and provide food for that fish. Bears, eagles, and a whole bunch of other fish are going to feed off of her carcass. A little bit closer to home, these are Atlantic salmon. And Atlantic salmon, wild Atlantic salmon, are critically endangered. They only occur in Maine now. They used to occur all the way down as far south as the southern end of Massachusetts. They're now only in a couple of rivers in Maine. And I was fortunate enough to spend some time on the Bold Coast, also called the Cold Coast, because it's one of the coldest portions of the ocean in North America. It's also the fastest warming. With the Downey Salmon Federation, who are really taking a strong stand to try to protect these fish from going extinct. And they raise salmon parr in a hatchery in a really specialized technique to restore wild populations. So most hatchery-raised fish are placed in a river with the idea that they're going to get fished out, right? Put and take fishery. We make rainbow trout in hatcheries. We put them in rivers. They're not native to here, by the way. Rainbows are native to the West Coast, not to the East, but they're fun to fish and people love it, and it brings people to the river. But the idea of putting rainbow trout, hatchery-raised rainbows into a creek or a river is to provide recreation and support for people to pull those fish out. The Downey Salmon Federation are raising all these fish. These are all Atlantic salmon parr with the intent of having them reach maturity in that river, migrate back out to sea, spend a couple of years at sea, come back in as wild, mature Atlantic salmon and spawn. And they're seeing some success. They're starting to see increased numbers of smolts, which are the oldest stage of those juveniles attained before they head out to sea and finish their maturation process. And then I learned while I was there about this other fish called the tomcod that is also migratory. They live in shallow coastal regions, and they come into the head of the tide. So right where the tide meets fresh water at the solstice in the wintertime. So right around Christmas is when these fish are migrating to spawn. And of course, all the rivers in Maine right around Christmas look like this, and they spawn at night. So I'm breaking ice in this river at about midnight to get to this fish that I don't even know if it exists anymore. They used to be extremely popular. People would go out and spear them and put them in Christmas stews. They're apparently extremely tasty, but because their numbers crashed years ago, they really came out of culture. And so the culture surrounding those tomcod has disappeared. And only the older folks in the community remember tomcod stew on Christmas morning from the tomcod that were caught Christmas Eve. And so the Downey Salmon Federation is just now starting to do research on the existence and the population numbers of tomcod. And I was fortunate enough that, after driving about 13 hours New Year's Eve to get up to this place, to break ice, to get into that dark water at midnight, thinking that this was a complete and total waste of time, found a male tomcod. They're the cutest little fish. They got this little barbel that hangs under their chin, just like a cod in the ocean. And there was a mass of those tomcod that were there spawning. And this was one of the rare instances that we were actually able to photograph a tomcod in its natural habitat doing its own thing. So that's the most photographed, that's the most viewed tomcod in the country right now because of that one shot that I got that worked after the 13-hour drive up into that frozen river. And then we have some migrants that are a lot closer to home. So these are river herring. And, the mid-Atlantic population of river herring has declined 90% in the last 25 years. And that's a really scary prospect. These are migratory fish. And so they spend their lives out at sea. They come up into freshwaters to spawn. But unlike salmon, these are multiple spawners. And so they'll come into the freshwater multiple times over multiple years to spawn. It's not a once and done thing for them like it is for the salmon. But they're going down in number, largely because of overfishing, but also, again, dams. Anytime we put a dam in a river, we're really severing those migration routes for migratory fish. And most people don't understand that there are many, many fish species that are migratory, and these happen to be one of them. And so, I do a lot of outdoor education. And I think sometimes we tend to present a pretty negative view of how the world is going and what's going on with the environment. So, what do you hear in that seashell? Well, I hear sea level rising, I hear bluefin tuna being hunted, I hear boat people crying, there's villages being swept away. I want my iPod back. And there's a growing body of evidence that indicates that, the reason that we pay attention to things that really don't matter a whole lot, like, what the Kardashians are wearing or what the royal family is saying, is because the real world sometimes is a bit overwhelming. And here's the example with these fish, right? So I could stand here and tell you that they suffered a 90% decline in the last 25 years, but if I put a mask and a snorkel on you, and I put you in the river with these fish in the middle of their spawn with 2,000 or 3,000 fish spawning, so you can experience the energy of that next generation being produced and the chaos of the spawn, all of a sudden that 90% reduction takes on a real meaning. And it scares me to think that my grandkids might not get the opportunity to experience these fish the way I've been able to. And I can't imagine what they were 2 generations before me, because this is a depauperate number of fish. But at the same time, as much despair as that 90% reduction inspires in me, being in these rivers when these fish are spawning, it gives me hope. I mean, they're still there in thousands, by the thousands. They still come up into our rivers and streams throughout the mid-Atlantic, wherever we let them without a dam, and they still try to make the next generation. And it gives me hope, and it's proof that if we just give life a half a chance, it'll make it. And same thing with these herring. If we just give them the chance, they're going to take it and they're going to run with it. And there's other things in the rivers besides fish, things that have a bad reputation and are often misidentified, like this beautiful, beautiful animal, which is a northern water snake. It's not a copperhead. It's not a water moccasin, which is what I hear all the time. Water moccasins occur pretty far to the south. Southern end of Virginia is as far north as they come. These are water snakes. And they're just beautiful, beautiful animals. Just incredible coloration on them and incredible hunting ability. So I followed this one into a waterfall, and I watched her hunt in a waterfall, and just amazing ability at camouflage, at being able to navigate really complex currents, at plucking huge fish out of the water. They perform a critically important function as a top predator in our river ecosystems, and they are so maligned. The number of times that I see these things that are stoned to death because people are afraid of them, they just don't understand. And the number of stories I've heard about the cottonmouth that was there, and it's not a cottonmouth, it's a northern water snake. And the northern water snake chased me. I've never been chased by a northern water snake. I've had a hard time keeping up with them to get a halfway decent picture. And other organisms that are kind of that their name evokes a certain meaning that's opposite of what they actually are. So this is a sucker, and this is a white sucker. And when you hear the word sucker, that word connotes oafishness and stupidity and sluggishness and maybe laziness, right? But these animals are exactly opposite that. They are incredibly beautiful and adept swimmers. And this particular one is a northern hogsucker, and these things are in the swiftest water that I've ever been able to be in without getting swept downstream. And, suckers aren't supposed to do that, right? When you think of sucker, it's this big, lunky kind of fish. But if you look at how this body morphology of this fish is, it's got that sloped head, and it's got these really big wing-like pectoral fins. And so the water just hits the head and hits those big wing pectoral fins, and it keeps them plastered to the bottom. And the coloration of northern hogsuckers is just beautiful, just amazing. And this is another shot of a northern hogsucker that really shows the big sucker disc mouth right there in the front, and how big those pectoral fins are to help keep that fish plastered to the bottom in the strongest of currents. And this is a white sucker. This is another really common sucker that we have in our eastern rivers. And these things are some of the most powerful, agile swimmers that I've ever had the pleasure of being in the water with. They gather up in really large schools right about the end of winter, right around February to start their spawn. And sucker spawning is just as thrilling to be a part of as herring spawning. And they work the river with that big sucker disc mouth, and then other fish take advantage of that. So what you can see here is these 2 bass are on each side of this sucker in the middle. And as that sucker goes and uses that sucker disc to grub up food from the bottom, it creates a food slick that goes downstream, and these bass take advantage of it. And so these bass know that suckers mean additional food for them based on what they're grubbing up. And so, you know, another really common fish for us are bass that we often dismiss. And yet some of the most incredible behavior I've had the opportunity to experience have been bass. Like this one. This is from the Catskills. And this is a big male down on the bottom in about 15 feet of water. And he's guarding his nest. So it's another pretty common behavior in fish is that the males often guard the young and the eggs in the nest. But watch what he does when he notices me over top of his nest. So he's really curious. He's coming up to try to figure out what's going on. Those are my fingers that are wiggling off the side of the frame there. He's trying to figure out if I'm an enemy, if I'm food, what's going on, and then he's going to turn around and head back down to protect his young. And this is another smallmouth bass that I think I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Every time I go in a river, I'm really careful to look to see that I'm not going in on top of a fish nest. And those fish nests usually look like a bowl that's kind of carved into the bottom. And I didn't see anything. This is in the Delaware River, right up near the Pennsylvania or the New York line. Didn't see any bowls or anything, so I got in the river, and this is what happened. That smallmouth is obviously really agitated at me. I'm in the wrong place at the wrong time. I must be infringing on his nest because he's coming at me strong and hard. And that's a rock bass. And that rock bass nest is in that little A-shaped hut right there made out of rock. And that smallmouth bass got too close to that rock bass nest. And so the rock bass came out after the smallie. So the smallie is coming after me because of my wrong place in the river. And now that rock bass is coming out after that smallie because of its wrong place in the river. You can't see these behaviors in a seine net, right? You can't see these behaviors when you have the fish on the end of a fishing line. And I still love to go fishing, and I still love all the other river activities, but this completely changes my view of what river life is like when you look at it from under the surface. And then the sunfish are also part of that bass family, and some of the most colorful sunfish that or some of the most color fish that we have are sunfish, like this red breast sunfish. And these males just put on this brilliant, brilliant color in breeding season. And here's a male on the left with a female who's on the right in his bowl. And so all that clean sand that you see surrounding that is this huge 3 to 4 foot diameter nest bowl that male created. And he's courting that female. And here's what some of that courtship looks like. And so he's just kind of herding her around and fertilizing eggs up. Somebody who was coming into his territory, so he had to go defend his turf. And now he's got to herd the female back up. There's somebody else. He's got to run after that one to keep the males out. Now he's back, and the female is still interested. Up, somebody else came in. So what I take away from that is it's a lot of work being a male sunfish to try to have babies and protect your territory. And this is another really cool fish with a really complicated reproductive strategy. So this is a chub. He's right here in the middle. He's the guy with all the white dots on his head, and that's a big rock in his mouth. And he's building this mound of stone that's on the bottom right here. And so what chubs do, here's one that's got these bumps. These are all called tubercles. And we're not 100% sure on the purpose of these tubercles. We assume that they're used as part of mating because the males only grow them in the spring when they're spawning. And so we think it might be something that the males use to attract a female, that the male that has the most number of tubercles might be a sign of reproductive fitness and might be attractive to a female. But I've also seen males headbutt each other for prime breeding spots. And so it could be males using those horns to swat each other out of the way to get the prime breeding spots in the river. Or maybe it's both of those things, or maybe it's neither, right? We're kind of interpreting that through the lens of reproduction is the most important thing to these fish. And maybe at this time of year it is. But here's a good video of what it looks like for a male to build his chub mound. And so you'll see this guy coming up from the back. There he is with a rock in his mouth. He's going to deposit it. And then he's going to go back and he's going to get another one. And all those other fish, all those redfish are Tennessee shiners. And they put on this really brilliant crimson color right about now for the spawning season. This was shot in Tennessee, in the Hiawassee River in Tennessee. And so what the male does is he'll lay down a layer of rock, and then he'll spawn with a female. And so those other brown, bigger fish that you see there are the female chubs. So the female and the male will, the female will put eggs down and the male will fertilize them, and they fall between the cracks in those cobbles and those pebbles that the male's bringing up. And then he lays another layer of rock on top of that to protect those fertilized eggs from getting eaten by other fish. And so in the course of 2 days, I watched this male in the same spot. This was the very beginning of him building that nest. It went from 0 to about 2 foot tall and 4 foot diameter in the course of 2 days of that male just bringing more rock in and spawning with females and bringing more rock in and spawning with females, and just seeing all the other species that are dependent on that chub mound for their reproduction. So all these Tennessee shiners and war paint shiners were all using that same chub mound for their own use and egg laying. And so it results in supporting this amazing, beautiful community of incredible diversity of these striped shiners, and there's a war paint shiner right in the background, and this chestnut brown individual in the very front with all the white bumps. That's a stone roller who's digging pits in those mounds to lay their eggs. And closer to home, we have these in Allegany. We have these all throughout Pennsylvania. This is another chub mound, and these are common shiners. So these are common shiner males. You'll see the chub coming up. There he is. He'll deposit a pebble, and he's going to go back and get another one. And so that's his home. That's his chub mound that he's using for reproduction. But those common shiners are also using the same space for their reproduction. And so, you know, common shiners, the name, they are what they are. They're one of the most common fish that we have. And, you know, throughout most of I think they're beautiful all year long. But in the springtime, right about now, the males put on this brilliant color display to attract the females. When you go to a bait store and you buy shiners for bait, that's what you're getting, is a common shiner, also known as bait. But really brilliant displays, even in our local streams. Just incredible coloration from those fish right about now. But one of our most beautifully colored fish in the East is a brook trout. It's the only native trout that we have on the East Coast. Brown trouts are originally from Europe. And we said already that, you know, rainbows are from the West Coast. And so the only native trout that we have here are brookies. And they are just incredibly beautifully colored fish. And we're really worried about these fish. They require extremely clear, extremely cold, extremely unpolluted water. And so brook trout range is really starting to shrink in the East because rivers are warming up due to climate change. They're getting muddy because of more and more logging, more and more development, more and more mining. And so sedimentation is increasing. And so we're really worried that these fish aren't going to survive in their native range within the next 100 years. In fact, there was a report that the EPA came out with about 4 years ago that predicted the extinction of brook trout in their native range. Now, they're invasive in the Rockies, right? So they've been introduced in the West, and they're causing problems for cutthroat trout in the West. But the prediction is that the fish here are going to go extinct in their native range where they belong. In the process of writing this book, I met a young woman who was going for her PhD at Penn State, Shannon White, extremely knowledgeable about these trout. She probably knows about Pennsylvania brook trout better than anybody. And she doesn't agree with the EPA prediction. And so here's a little brook trout just demonstrating how agile and how powerful and how athletic they are. But Shannon doesn't believe that they're going to go extinct in their home range, in their native range, as long as we can let them move throughout the river system. And so these are not migratory fish in that they don't go to the ocean and come back in. But Shannon learned that they migrate pretty extensively throughout the same river system. And so they'll spend maybe the wintertime in the deeper water of the main stem. And then when that water warms up, they head up into the smallest tributaries where the springs are coming out, where the groundwater is coming out. And those are the cold water refuges for these fish in warming temperatures. And so she really thinks that if we remove the barriers to their ability to move throughout that river system, culverts that don't let them pass through, poorly constructed bridges, dams, poor logging practices that dump a lot of gravel and sediment into rivers, if we correct those things, Shannon really believes that they're going to make it. Now, she also found that those fish start producing heat stress proteins at a much lower temperature than what we thought. We thought that they started stressing, you know, right about 60 degrees. And what she found is heat stress proteins start getting produced right around 52 or so. So there's almost an 8-degree cooler difference between what we thought was a problem for them in terms of heat and what Shannon found in her research. But it's also very encouraging in that, you know, if we remove those barriers to their ability to move around rivers, those most beautiful are only native trout, such a huge part of the natural history of you know, the New York and Pennsylvania region and the cultures there, the outdoor cultures, and just the ecosystem. They'll make it if we just give them the chance. There's other beauty going on rivers right now too that's a little bit more hidden. This is a very, very common fish. It's called the tessellated darter. It's a male, and these males right now become this bronze, golden maroon, and part of their beauty is the complex behaviors that they exhibit in competing for a breeding space. And so these are 3 males that are actually fighting for the right to occupy those crevices in those rocks. You just saw that one male go in there, and right here in the middle, you'll see a female, right? There's one, and he's defending that turf. There's a female in the middle that you're gonna see coming up here in a minute, right in this middle crevice. And that's what they're really fighting over. So that male just went into that middle crevice. You see the female sticking her face out? What she's doing is she's gluing eggs to the roof of that rock, and the male's fertilizing them. And so what I found was the females weren't really selecting the males based on the male. The females were selecting the males based on who occupied the best habitat for her eggs. The best protected spot for her eggs, that was the male that won. And a lot of times those fights between males became pretty violent. I mean, they would latch onto each other's fins and tumble down the river. And so what you see here, there's a male right here. There's his tail, and he's biting onto part of the dorsal fin of that other male right here. And they would just latch on for a couple of seconds and tumble down the river. And the result is a male that's successful will then guard his eggs. And this is some video of that. So this male is guarding eggs that are glued to the top of that understory, underside of that rock right there. And he's looking at me, and he's really debating about whether he's going to take me on, something that's hundreds of times his size. He's like, there he goes. I have his attention now. I'm in his territory. He decides against it. He goes out, he does this 3-foot circuit around his house, shooing away any other fish. Now he comes back. You're going to see him flip upside down. There he goes, and you're going to see him wiggle. There's the wiggle. What he's doing is he's aerating, and he's dusting off his eggs. So darter eggs are really susceptible to suffocation if they get covered by sediment. And so that male will guard those eggs and do that little wiggle to keep them sediment free until they hatch. And darters are some of our most beautiful fish in North America. And they only occur on this continent, by the way. I believe there's like somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 species of darter, and many of them are endangered. And they often occur in southeastern rivers and streams, and often in a very, very tiny little range. And that's one of the reasons why so many of these organisms, these darters, are endangered, because they don't have a very wide range. They're just maybe in one little creek in Tennessee. This one is not in that category, however. This is a green-sided darter. Again, we can find this in Lake Erie. We can find this in the creeks all throughout Pennsylvania. It prefers creeks rather than lakes, but they do occur in lake habitats. We can find this throughout a lot of New York. And these males just put on this beautiful green color for spawning. This is a fish from Missouri. This is an orange throat darter. Just brilliant, and they really are brilliant year-round. I mean, the males get brighter right about now to spawn, but these fish stay colorful throughout the year. This is a redline darter from Tennessee. This is a really cool fish. This is called the Chesapeake log perch. And this is from my area. I live on the Susquehanna River, the lower Susquehanna, below Conowingo Dam, so right about where the Susquehanna comes in and forms the Chesapeake Bay. And these fish occur through the lower Susquehanna Valley, and they are globally rare. So they only occur in a handful of streams in the Riverlands region of the Susquehanna Valley. And so it's a pretty scary prospect that if anything happens, say we have a car accident or a tractor trailer overturns and one of the saddle tanks empties into one of these streams, or maybe there's an agricultural spill. We just wiped out half of the world's population potentially by eliminating those fish from that one stream. And so it's a scary prospect, but at the same time, they're locally abundant, right? So there's a lot of hope for these fish. In fact, the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission just did a really successful spawning program to try to boost their numbers. And one of the cool things about them is how they use their pointy noses to get food. And so you see this one, these two, that are using their pointy snouts to find food. And so they're sticking their mouths and their snouts into these crevices, And you'll see one here in a minute flipping a rock. There he goes, right? And they're looking for benthic macroinvertebrates, their food. They're looking for these guys, right? This is a stonefly. And these are amazing, amazing creatures, beautiful creatures. There's another stony with just this really beautiful, intricate pattern. And so these animals, these insects live in the water for about 2 years as this nymph. And then they emerge as an adult. And this is actually the exoskeleton of the nymph stuck to a piece of grass on the side of the Delaware River in New York. And these are the adults, stoneflies. And they have one thing on their mind, and that's reproduction. These animals don't even have mouth parts as adults. So their only purpose as an adult is to reproduce and to form the next generation of stonies. And, you know, aquatic insects are just absolutely amazing, and they could be a topic of an entire presentation just by themselves. And then we have mayflies, like this beautiful mayfly. This is a swimming mayfly, and this is a crawling mayfly. And these emerge into winged adults like this. There's signs of pretty good water quality. Both stoneflies and mayflies require pretty clean water. And the wing patterns on these adults are really amazing. And again, mayflies are very similar to stonies in that the adults don't eat. They're there to reproduce, and you know their genus is Ephemeroptera. And so because they're very ephemeral, they live for a very, very short time as a winged adult, total lifespan of 2 to 3 years. And then we have caddisflies. And so caddis are closely related to moths and butterflies in that they have this larval stage, and they make these cocoons out of twigs, out of rocks, out of plant material. So you can see these are filter feeders right here. So these are the front legs, the forelegs of these caddisflies, just kind of holding up into the current to capture whatever food comes down, and they grab it and they put it into their mouths. And here is one of the larvae that's extended out of its tube, that beautiful green color, and all that white is it's actually its respiratory tract, its respiratory system is all that white. And sometimes they make some of the most beautiful cases out of these crystal pebbles, and then they emerge as an adult. And this is really cool, and it still blows my mind that this is a female caddisfly that's walking back down into the river to lay eggs. And so she's all silver because she's got these fine hairs on her body that trap air and allow her to crawl back into the river to lay eggs. And I just witnessed this again this year. This is the time when they're hatching and the females are coming back in to lay eggs in mass. There were hundreds of these female caddisflies walking down into this stream on the face of this rock and laying these little globes of eggs. And then we have other incredible invertebrates besides the insects. This is a freshwater mussel. And so this gap right on the top and on the bottom there, those are its valves, right? So in-current and ex-current siphon. They pull water in, they filter food out of that water to eat, and they filter everything else out of that water. So they filter sediment, they filter algae that's not food for them out of that water. They even filter virus particles out of the water, and they wad up whatever they can't eat, and they spit it to the bottom as pseudofeces. And so when we talk about water filtration, a lot of times we're only talking about the oysters that might occur, in the Chesapeake Bay or in the Hudson or in the Delaware Bay. And we're missing 50% of the organisms that perform that critically important water filtration function by not talking about these amazing animals, these freshwater mussels. And these are critically imperiled in North America. There's 273 species in North America. 75% are threatened or endangered. They've got a really complicated life history, and that's one of the reasons why they're in trouble, is that they require an adult host, a fish host, in order to successfully reproduce. So there's a male and a female mussel. The male just distributes sperm into the water column. The female brings that in through her in-current siphon. She fertilizes eggs that then turn into glaucidia, which are basically larval mussels. They require some kind of a host to live on parasitically for about a month as they metamorphose into a juvenile mussel. That host could be an aquatic insect like a hellgrammite. It could be a crayfish. Most of those hosts are some kind of a fish. As far as we know, those larval stages that live parasitically don't do any harm to their host. After about a month, the juveniles drop off to the bottom as a subadult, and then they live the rest of their lives in the river. Some of these mussels can live to be 100 years old, right? So when we think of a clam or a mussel or something like that, I certainly never thought of them as this long-lived organism. And yet the ones that are most common in our region, Eastern Elliptio complanata, that are most common in our area, easily live to be 100. And so some of these female mussels have developed really intricate ways to attract fish, right? So if you're a female mussel, you want to give your juveniles, your babies, every opportunity of success to make it in life. And so you're going to do what you can to draw that right fish in that you need as the parasite, as the host. And so this female mussel, this is a Lampsilis, develops these mussels. You see these two eye spots that are wiggling there? That's a mussel who's developed these lures that look like minnows. And so that fish is going to come in there and bite on that lure. And then these two really swollen parts in the middle right there are her marsupial gills. When that fish gets close enough, she opens those marsupial gills up, and the baby, the Glaucidia, infests the gills and the fins of that fish. And she successfully sent her next generation on its course. It's just some of the most fascinating biology on the planet is the relationship of mussels to their host fish. And it's a real shame that we're losing them at a really rapid rate. That, again, of the 273 species of freshwater mussel in North America, 75% are either endangered or threatened. And this is a picture of our Eastern Elliptio, one of the most common that we have in our region. And these are considered stable, but their numbers are dropping. One of the scary things for me is on the Susquehanna River, we're not seeing any juveniles of these Eastern Elliptios above Conowingo Dam. Conowingo Dam is the first dam on the Susquehanna River. Anything above Conowingo, we're really not seeing young being recruited into the population. And Conowingo is coming up on its 100th anniversary. And so we're worried that we're going to lose Eastern Elliptios because this is an old juvenile. We're not seeing young ones anymore. Because they can live to be 100, we think that the mussels that we're seeing largely above Conowingo Dam are remnants from pre-dam existence. And one of the reasons we think that's the case is because of the relationship with this amazing animal. This is an American eel. And American eels are also migratory. They spend their lives in rivers and streams, opposite of shad and opposite of herring, right? So those are anadromous. They spend their lives at sea and they come into fresh water to spawn. This is considered catadromous. It spends its life in fresh water and it goes to the Sargasso Sea to spawn, which is an incredible journey in and of itself. And so we still don't understand the biology behind this. In fact, we only recently confirmed that these fish migrate to the Sargasso Sea. It was always theorized because we would catch the planktonic eels right around the Sargasso Sea in plankton toes. And so that's how we thought that's where these animals went. But a radio tagged American eel from New England recently was followed to the Sargasso. And so that's why we've confirmed, but we've never witnessed what that spawning looks like. So the Sargasso Sea is basically this big ocean current that's essentially the Bermuda Triangle in terms of geography. And so these fish live in relatively shallow fresh water for their entire lives, could be 25 or 30 years. And then they start migrating. And we don't know what the cue is to get them to migrate because they're not sexually mature yet. They start to sexually mature as they head downriver. So we would think that the migration would start once they reach sexual maturity, but that's not the trigger. So we don't even really know why they start migrating. But they go down to the Sargasso Sea, and then the babies come back. They start out as these little planktonic forms called leptocephali that kind of float on the currents, and they slowly transform into glass eels that come up into the rivers. And there's a huge glass eel fishery still in Maine that's worth a lot of money because in Asia they fished out their eels, and so a lot of the glass eel market are fishermen that are taking the glass eels and shipping them to Asia for use in aquaculture, that they're then raised in an aquaculture setup in Asia. And then they wind up being these little elvers that come back up into our rivers and streams. The problem on the Susquehanna, though, is that 10 miles in, they hit Conowingo Dam. And a friend of mine, Julie Devers, who's a biologist with the Fish and Wildlife Service, just recently learned, about 5 years ago, that up to 10,000 elvers a day in July and August can't get back up through Conowingo Dam to repopulate the rest of the Susquehanna River. That's 10,000 baby eels a day in July and August. That's a crazy number of eels. And so we're seeing a decline in the adult population of eels above Conowingo Dam, commensurate with no recruitment or reduced recruitment, reduced young being produced of Eastern Elliptio mussel. And we think they're related. That while Eastern Elliptio mussels are more of a generalist mussel in terms of the fish that they depend on for reproduction, eels are their preferred fish based on how they produce their Glaucidia. It looks like a cobweb that's in the cobble. And so it makes a lot of sense that as those eels kind of snake through the substrate of the river, that they would get infested with the Glacidia of the eastern Elliptio. Now, the bright side is there's now an eel lift on Conowingo Dam. It's on this left side, this left corner. It's actually technology that was developed in Ireland. It's this eel ramp where the eels kind of squiggle up this coconut fabric into a big tub, and then they're trucked up into Pennsylvania. And we're seeing in the creek where the baby eels were deposited, we're seeing recruitment of eastern Elliptio complanata, of eastern Elliptio mussels. And so that's a pretty good bright spot. That piece of information that my friend Julie Devers figured out resulted in a change in how we manage that, and we can overcome it. And so, in the process of doing this book, I learned a ton about fish that I never knew existed, and it had a pretty deep effect. And so I wanted to share with you one of the big pieces of learning that I got when I was in California, because I rarely go to the West Coast to do any kind of work. Most of my work is here in New York and Pennsylvania and Maryland. I'm doing a bit more up in New England, a bit in Virginia and Tennessee, but California is a stretch. And I discovered this fish while I was in California. And so I was in wine country, and I went to Mendocino National Forest to get up into some of the rivers right at the end of the Mendocino Fire Complex. So this was, I think, 2 summers ago when California was really hammered by forest fires, because fires affect river ecosystems as well. And I wanted to document what that effect was. And then this experience happened on my return back to the wine country. So I'll read you a little bit of an excerpt from that. I returned to wine country and landed at Sunset Beach on the Russian River. The same water quality warning signs were hammered into the gravel, which I ignored. Thick willow tangles lined the shoreline. Behind them, sequoia touched the sky, though these juveniles were dwarves compared to their giant grandfathers and grandmothers, who would still be standing if we hadn't taken them down. The Russian ponds here, backed up by a large gravel bar and shallow riffle. Fish dimpled the surface and sent concentric rings out from where they nabbed an insect. I was encouraged by the feeding activity that maybe I might see some fish. I slipped into the river as quietly and stealthily as I could. Murky water and algae covered a featureless bottom. I crept toward the banks, where the willow tangles dipped into the water, hoping that the structure would hold fish. However, a good current flowed through the willows, so I was cautious about getting hung on a strainer. I watched what I thought was a new kind of sunfish for me, nesting under the willows. They had a flat oval body shape of a small sunny and were silver with black leopard spots. It looked like they were nesting in the submerged tangle of willow boughs, and I just watched as they darted through the branches with ease. I felt like I was disturbing the fish, so I slowly backed out of the willows, making sure to not let the current mat me to one of the submerged branches. I was able to get a few marginal photos, good enough to make a positive identification. These cute little leopard-spotted fish were tule perch, the only kind of freshwater surf perch. Their range is limited to Central California. Because of its limited range, it is at risk, even if it isn't formally assessed as at risk. I never knew these fish existed. Even if I had known they existed, it is entirely different to know these fish underwater on their terms. How many other freshwater species will I never know before they are gone? There's a timelessness to all this, a feeling that I am among beings and processes that make my life nothing more than a small, insignificant blip. And yet what I do directly impacts these timeless beings and processes. I either disrupt and kill or enhance and heal. That night I had Dungeness crab cooked on an open fire beneath towering redwoods. I'm so small and insignificant compared to these trees, yet I have the power to kill them. I'm so small and insignificant compared to the rivers I snorkel, yet I can kill them too. And that's what a lot of this comes down to. We've got these amazingly beautiful fish, right? Like this candy darter that was just listed as endangered, by the way. This is from Virginia, not very far south of here. And we have a hard time getting our act together to protect something that is this beautiful from leaving this planet for good. This isn't a fish. And it's not even from North America. It's from Australia. It's a leadbeater's possum, critically endangered in Australia. And so that's the concern, that if we can't get our act together to save these cute, fuzzy bundles of cuteness, how are we going to get our act together to save something that looks like that, which is a hellbender, which is the Pennsylvania state amphibian? The largest salamander that we have in North America. These things grow to be about 1.5 feet. The range is shrinking, just like the brook trout. They require the same thing as brook trout, clear, cold water. They don't tolerate sediment at all. Their eggs experience almost 100% mortality in sediment. And that's what's killing these animals off. They used to be in our area. They used to be in the Susquehanna River. The last one that was caught below Conowingo Dam was in 1989. This animal might disappear in my lifetime. So every time I get on a plane, I look at the rivets around the door and the window frames. And I ask myself, how many of these rivets can be missing before I make the decision to not get on that plane? Before I figure that that frame is just going to be too fragile to be able to stay in the air. Well, each one of those rivets is a species on this planet. And the same thing holds true for our biosphere. That regardless of whether it looks like that, which I think is actually really beautiful, by the way. I think hellbenders are just incredible animals. Or if it looks like that, or if it looks like that, you know, all of those species are rivets in our biosphere. And that if we don't work to protect them, our biosphere is going to crash, including animals that look like this, sea lamprey. And they've got a really bad reputation because the damage that they continue to do in the Great Lakes, where they're invasive. But they're native where I live. And this is a migratory fish, right? So this fish will spend, where I'm from, in Maryland, this fish will spend its life out at sea. It comes into freshwater to spawn, which is what this male is in the process of doing. Its nose is all battered and white because it just spent a couple of days building a nest. It's about 3-foot bowl. He was moving bowling ball-sized cobble out of the way with his sucker mouth. They're also maligned because of the way they make a living, right? They're parasitic. They're actually a predator, but they kill fish by parasitizing them to death. So it makes them a predator. They latched onto a fish. They've got this sucker disc with these raspy teeth. They rasp through the skin of the fish, and they suck the blood and the body fluids out of the fish to the point of mortality, to the point of death. So how they make a living isn't appealing to a lot of people. The fact that when you do a Google search or a web search on sea lamprey, just about the only thing you hear about is the damage that they're doing in the Great Lakes, which cannot be denied, but you don't know that they're native here. In fact, the day I found that fish, I was with a group of 5th graders, and I didn't know that they were native to this stream. This is below Conowingo Dam in the Susquehanna River. And I've got this fish in my hands, and I'm telling the students about the natural history. I'm like, yeah, these are invasive. And I looked them up, and they were not invasive. The Maryland Department of Natural Resources webpage had them listed as invasive. Here's a range map. So all the maroon areas are where they're not native, where they're doing a lot of damage to fisheries. All the amber or yellow areas are where they're native, the entire eastern seaboard. Amazing life history that these fish will spend 6 years out at sea, come into spawn, the eggs hatch, they turn into these things called ammocetes. They metamorphose after 6 years as an ammocetes. The ammocetes are filter feeders. So they have these hoods that they stick out of soft sediments and filter the water of our rivers, which again, in terms of ecological function, is critically important. Transform into a juvenile, head back out to sea, transform into a mature adult, live there for 6 years, and then come back in and start it over again. So really complicated, incredible migratory life history. And there's a counterpart on the West Coast called the Pacific lamprey. And so in the process of doing this book, before doing this book, I learned about this man. His name was Elmer Crow. A good friend of mine runs Freshwater's Illustrated, which is an amazing organization that does underwater videography and storytelling of our freshwater rivers. And one of the stories that Freshwater's Illustrated told was about Pacific lamprey and the work of the Nez Perce Indians in trying to protect those lamprey. And so Pacific lamprey are critically important to Nez Perce culture. They consider the lamprey to be their brothers because the lamprey have fed the Nez Perce people through millennia, through really difficult food times. They could always count on the lamprey being there. And they're really central to a lot of Nez Perce ceremony. And a Nez Perce elder by the name of Elmer Crow stood right on this very spot and watched what he thought was the last Pacific lamprey swim over that flat that's right there in the foreground. And he thought it was the last eel. So Nez Perce call lamprey eel. And he asked the creator, why did you show me this last eel? What's the significance of this? Why did you show me this last fish? And then it dawned on Elmer that it was up to him to do something about it. And so Elmer single-handedly started a lamprey truck and transport program, because the reason the lamprey aren't getting up into Nez Perce home territory in Idaho is because they can't get past all the dams on the Columbia River. And so what the Nez Perce do, because of Elmer, is they set traps below the Bonneville Dam, and they bring the lamprey back up into their home territory, and they hold them in a hatchery over the winter, and then they release the adults in the spring so that they could at least reproduce normally in their home streams. And this was Homer's life philosophy. We are the circle. That's what life is all about. We take care of one another. So when we have someone in trouble, that's when the rest of us have to step in. And unfortunately, I never got to meet Elmer in person. He drowned the year the film came out about his work. And so I never got to meet him. I got to meet his family. I called his family and I explained to them the effect that Elmer's story had on me and how I share his life philosophy. I want to make sure they were okay with me using his image and his life philosophy in these presentations. And they were honored that I was spreading the word about Elmer's work with Pacific lamprey. And so I got to meet his son and his family, and it was just such an incredible experience. But that really resonates, and that's what this is all about, right? Elmer's talking about taking care of one another, not just the human one another's, but the non-human one another's, the fish and the lamprey and the birds and the insects and all of these amazing things that come together, all these amazing beings that come together to make this beautiful planet that we share. And that's what Elmer did. And I think that's what we're all charged to do, especially in this time of COVID, right? I mean, that was a big part of this, is taking care of each other as we have to social distance and isolate. And Lon, thanks for putting this together, because I think this is a big part of taking care of everybody, right? Of staying connected, of making the best of a hard situation. But we also have to take care of those non-human beings as well. And so thank you so much for being here tonight. If you have any questions, we can take them now. That's the best way to get a hold of me right there, Keith@freshwaterjourneys.com. And so if you have a question that you think of afterwards, just send me an email. If you're interested in more information about trips or books or presentations, that's the best way to contact me.
All right. Hey, Keith, that was wonderful. Actually, we got a couple chat questions online. If you mind if I ask right now, someone asked, are these talks going to be available online? Yes, we're going to post those online to our website, AlleganyNaturePilgrimage.com. One of the questions that I had was, first of all, there was a question about photography, and there was another question. Let's see, Laura Cambria had a question regarding photography, but also said, how did lampreys get to the Great Lakes, and how are they reproducing without a sea phase to their lives?
Yeah, so my understanding is, and somebody online might know the story of lamprey in the Great Lakes better than I, was the construction of canals facilitated their spread from their native territory into the Great Lakes region. And there are amazing migratory fish in the there are salmon in the Great Lakes that are also migratory. The difference is that they use the Great Lakes as the ocean, as that sea phase, and they come up into the tributary rivers to the Great Lakes to spawn. And so they're still doing that migration. They're just not going out to sea. They're going into the Great Lakes, where they parasitize, the fish stocks in the Great Lakes, and that have no defense against those fish, which is why they're such a problem to the Great Lakes. And then they come into some of the tributary rivers to reproduce, to spawn.
Great, thank you. They've got a lot of compliments online. Does anybody else have a question? You take yourself off mute and ask Keith. We've got a few minutes here for any questions. Let's see, we've got a couple other things I'm looking here. Why don't, Paul Dare, let's see, Dare, why don't lamprey cause an environmental problem in their normal coastal habitat like they do in the Great Lakes?
Yeah, and usually, with invasive species in general, typically that problem comes in is because the natural checks that are in place to keep a population under control, right? Some of those disease checks, some defenses that their prey have against them. When we bring an animal into a new region, those checks on the population aren't there, right? And that applies to lamprey. It applies to lanternflies that are a big topic now. They're invading. And so by moving an animal from its native range into a non-native range, we eliminate the things that typically keep that population under control, so it can really just go crazy and grow rampantly.
Right.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I thought that the physiology was very different between saltwater fish and freshwater fish. So I'm kind of surprised that there's these migratory fish that change between the two environments. Could you explain a little bit about how the physiology changes to do that shift?
It totally blows my mind, right? Yeah, and the biggest one is the eel, I think, right? That's the biggest physiology shift, because it spends its life in freshwater, and a lot of that has to do with water balance and salt balance, right? So they spend their lives in freshwater, and so their physiology is keyed in to keeping water out of their body, right? Because their body is saltier. And then that shifts to the exact opposite when they go in the marine environment, right? They got to keep the salt out and keep the water in. And a lot of that is done through the kidneys, but I don't know how the physiology changes in a relatively short amount of time, right? So again, looking at the eels, not only are they adapting to saltwater environment from freshwater, they're also adapting to extremely deep marine environments. They're spawning, we think, at between 3,000 and 6,000 feet deep. After living in a maximum like maybe 30 feet deep, I mean, the eels that I see are in 3 feet of water, and they're spending their lives in 3 feet of water. So they're going from fresh to salt, from very shallow to very deep, from light to dark, and they're becoming sexually mature in the process, and they stop eating. So it's like, right? Amazing. Yeah. And then when we look at the salmon and the herring, they're equally amazing, only in the opposite direction, and maybe a little bit less so because it's not as drastic a change. But still, you just nailed some of the amazement at this stuff, right? That when you think about the underlying physiology and what these animals have to endure, it's incredible.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Keith, we really appreciate that. Again, thank you so very much. We got a lot of nice compliments on chat. You know, for helping us out. We really appreciate it so much for participating. It was a great presentation, and we hope to see you in person next year.
Yeah.
As well as everybody else that's online. We'd love to see you in person at the pilgrimage June 4th to 6th next year. So
yeah, I'll definitely be there, and we'll be ready to take people snorkeling next year. So
that sounds good to me.
It'll be a good time.
All right.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you very much.
That was so good. Thank you.